Hi, I'm Arun George, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. In today's episode, we're looking at what a report by the RBI tells us about how the Indian economy is dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. We're also looking at the outcome of a meeting between states and the central government on the goods and services tax. But first, we're talking about a 13,000-page charge sheet filed by the National Investigation Agency in connection with the 2019 Pulwama terror attack. On the 14th of February 2019, a convoy of 78 vehicles of the Central Reserve Police Force or CRPF began its journey from Jammu to Srinagar at 3:30 a.m. Most of the personnel on board those vehicles were returning from leave to join duty in Srinagar. Around 12 hours later, when the convoy was in Lethpura, around 35 kilometers from Srinagar, a car drove out onto the highway from a side lane and exploded. All 40 personnel aboard the fifth bus in the convoy and the suicide bomber were instantly killed. Many security personnel who were part of that convoy were injured. The Pulwama blast also set off a chain of events that raised tensions between India and Pakistan. First, India struck at a terror training camp run by the Jaish-e-Mohammed in Pakistan's Balakot, and Pakistan responded by a violation of Indian airspace. Almost a year and a half after the probe into the terror attack began, the National Investigation Agency or NIA filed a massive charge sheet that runs into over 13,000 pages in a Jammu court. Among the accused, there are 7 persons who have been arrested, 6 accused who were killed since the blast and the charge sheet being filed, and 6 who are wanted, the biggest of whom is terror group Jaish-e-Mohammed chief Masood Azhar. We're now speaking with the Indian Express's Deeptiman Tiwary, who covered the terror attack, the probe, and has reported on the charge sheet. We started by asking Deeptiman what's in this mammoth document.
Well, the most important thing in this is the kind of evidence that NIA has collected. Of course, it has unraveled the entire conspiracy where it is said that the entire thing has been planned on directions from Jaish-e-Mohammed in Pakistan. And it is said that every step of the attack had been directed from Pakistan over WhatsApp calls and messages and chats. It is also named Maulana Masood Azhar, his brother Rauf Asghar and Ammar Alvi as key accused in the charge sheet. Let's remember that the person in India who planned the entire attack and executed it was Muhammad Umar Farooq, who is the nephew of Masood Azhar. He was later killed in an encounter in March 2019, over a month after the attack. So NIA has given a lot of details about how this attack was actually planned, how it was executed.
Deeptiman says that according to the charge sheet, the plan started in 2018 when Umar Farooq entered India from Pakistan. The document also details who sheltered him and how he was asked to carry out the attack. The document also lists how Jaish-e-Mohammed terrorist Umar Farooq carried some explosives like RDX across the border with him, but other explosives were procured within Kashmir, and how the group managed to get the driver to carry out the suicide attack.
It is also said that they were also planning another attack, but the plan was shelved after the Balakot strikes and the international pressure that began building on Pakistan, and they were asked to lie low.
Deeptiman also explains why the evidence listed by the NIA in the charge sheet is important.
These are scientific electronic evidence, verifiable evidence, which connect the entire conspiracy and the attack to Pakistan and to Masood Azhar, his brother Rauf Asghar, and Ammar Alvi. These evidences include voice messages where the voice samples have been matched with open source voice samples of Rauf Asghar. Then there are WhatsApp call logs between Pakistan and India on the numbers that these guys are using here. Then there is a identity card of Pakistan government which had been given to Muhammad Umar Farooq, the key planner of the attack, which has also been found. Then there are lots of pictures from the time Muhammad Umar Farooq and his associates infiltrated into India in 2018 till the last detail of the plan and the execution. And after that, all those pictures have been found from the phone of Umar Farooq, which was recovered on his dead body.
Just in case you're unfamiliar with the terror group Jaish-e-Mohammed or JEM, here's a quick briefing on it. The terror group was created in 2000 by Masood Azhar. Azhar was in a Kashmir jail in 1999 when the Indian Airlines flight IC-814 was hijacked by terrorists. Azhar was one of the 3 terrorists who was flown to Kandahar in Afghanistan and released to secure the return of the flight's passengers. In fact, The hijackers of the flight are believed to have been his relatives. Since its formation, the Jaish-e-Mohammed has been involved in many big terror attacks in India. The bombing of the Jammu and Kashmir Assembly in 2001, the 2001 terror attack on Parliament, the 2016 attack on the Indian Air Force base in Pathankot, and the 2016 attack on an army camp in Uri are among those that the group has carried out over the past 2 decades. After 10 years of attempts by India, Azhar was designated a global terrorist in May 2019, and Pakistan issued an official order to freeze his financial assets and impose a travel ban on him. The big question is also, who are the 7 people who've been arrested in India and what charges do they face?
These are basically local Kashmiri people, largely from Pulwama, where the attack was carried out. They had been recruited by JEM operatives who have been in the valley for a long time. These include people who received Omar Farooq and his associates when they infiltrated into India on the international border, then carried them into a safe house in Kashmir, gave them shelter, provided them with food and other logistical support that they needed to stay there for as long as the attack was planned.
Deeptiman says that the other accused include a person who allegedly procured explosives locally for the car bomb, like gelatin sticks and ammonium nitrate. One of the accused allegedly procured materials like wires online. Other accused are a teenage girl and her father, who are accused of providing food and shelter to the conspirators.
There are people who conducted reconnaissance, like there is this shop owner who had his shop right on the highway. So he used to watch the movement of the convoy, and he provided the reconnaissance that was used to launch the attack. Then another guy was used to buy the car which was used in the attack. So these are the different sets of people who provided logistical support.
The prime accused, as per the charge sheet, is Masood Azhar, who is the founder of the Jaish-e-Mohammed terror group. But what evidence does India really have against him?
There is actually no direct evidence against him, like individually, personally involving him, because see, he's so high up the ladder that he does not involve himself operationally. He's largely the guiding light of the group, and his brothers, Rauf Asgar and Ammar Alvi, handle the operations. This is basically because the evidence that we have against Masood Azhar, that it is his group which was directly involved in the attack. The group claimed the entire attack in open source. They also eulogized those who conducted the attack in their magazine called Al Kalam. So these are the kind of evidences that India has against Masood Azhar. Of course, that his brother is directly involved in it, that the key planner of the attack was his nephew, are all evidences against him.
Now that the charge sheet has been filed, what does it do in terms of bringing the conspirators in Pakistan to justice?
Look, that is because in such cases, you will always need an international cooperation and cooperation from the country where the accused is hiding. Now, because everybody knows that these kind of attacks in India are sponsored by the state in Pakistan. So it is highly unlikely that the state will bring him to justice, as we have seen in 26/11 attacks. Not a single person has been brought to justice in Pakistan. No case has reached a logical conclusion, even though the entire world knows that this attack was launched from Pakistan. So there is nothing that is going to happen in Pakistan. Not that Pakistan is going to hand over Masood Azhar to India, or is it going to help in any way in conducting investigation in its own country. We all know what happened in the Pathankot attack, where they were forced to send an investigating team to India, but after that, nothing happened. Pakistan did nothing on its part to bring anyone to justice in Pakistan.
But Deeptiman says that while Pakistan may do little on its own, good evidence helps put pressure through international agencies like the Financial Action Task Force or FATF. FATF is a global money laundering and terrorist financing watchdog and has already got Pakistan on its grey list, which means the country is already under increased scrutiny. If blacklisted, Pakistan could face financial sanctions that could affect its government's ability to raise funds abroad.
These kind of evidences, when presented internationally with the international support, India will hope to push Pakistan in the blacklist, which will put severe financial sanctions on Pakistan and force its hand to take action against these terror groups. As we have already seen, because of the FATF pressure, Pakistan has put some sanctions on some 88 terror groups in its country and has been taking some sort of, even if ostensible and even if, something that is probably yet to be verified, but it has been taking some sort of action. So the only hope is that India can diplomatically isolate Pakistan on these issues and force hands of even countries such as China to take some sort of a stern action against Pakistan and the kind of terror activity that it sponsors.
But does one charge sheet against Azhar really matter given there's so many against him already?
At the end of the day, it will depend upon India's diplomatic heft. How much we are able to persuade other countries to do something about it. There was a time, in the 90s when India kept shouting through the roofs that, Pakistan was sponsoring terrorism in India and nobody in the world bothered. Then when these terrorists started knocking the doors of other countries and this terrorism really spread, when Al-Qaeda happened and its wires were seen connected to these groups in Pakistan as well, then countries like US woke up and they started putting pressure on Pakistan. And when there was a realization in the world that terrorism is global, there is nothing called a local terrorism. So now that we are living in a world where terrorism is seen as a global problem and various terror groups across the world are connected in some other way with the phenomenon of Al-Qaeda and Islamic State. So there is a growing realization in the world that there has to be a concerted effort to fight against terrorism. So probably the more such evidence we gather against Masood Azhar and the likes of Hafiz Saeed, we will be able to build some kind of international pressure on Pakistan. The one and only hope that one can see is that China had been blocking UNSC resolution against Masood Azhar, but it finally happened because of international pressure. So one can hope that such evidence, more and more as they come, will help India's cause in the international forums.
Deeptiman points out that Pakistan claims to have taken action against the Jaish-e-Mohammed, but Indian agencies say none of it is verifiable or of any consequence.
Pakistan keeps taking some or the other action under international pressure to show to the international community that it is serious about fighting India-centric terror groups. However, according to Indian agencies, Pakistan has not in any manner tried to dismantle the terror networks in any significant way of either JEM or LET or any other group which it has built to target India.
Before we get to the next segment, I just wanted your quick attention. One of the big reasons people say that they like this show is because it helps them understand the news better. It provides them with the context they need to see the bigger picture. And there's perhaps no other place that does this better than the Indian Express's Explained section. We on Three Things refer to the section regularly, and it helps us make this show. If you're a regular reader of the newspaper, you know how useful the Explained section can be, especially when you're looking for in-depth analysis by the right experts. You can log into indianexpress.com/explained and access their coverage 24/7. Explained by the Indian Express, where news that matters is explained by experts who know the subject. Now, back to the show. The Indian economy was already slowing in 2019. And then 2020 and the COVID-19 pandemic hit. On Tuesday, India's central bank released its annual report for the year 2019-20 and it made headlines. The Indian Express's Udit Misra, who writes on economy and finance for the Explained section, pointed out that that's not something it normally does.
RBI report this year has become more crucial. First of all, because COVID has led to a scenario where most households have seen their incomes fall, if not job losses, and people are concerned about the state of the economy. And second, very crucially, that RBI has actually led on the overall sort of institutional response that India has had in trying to recover from the COVID disruption. A lot of India's strategy to alleviate the stress, the economic stress that has been brought on by COVID, has been led by credit. So RBI is making that available. RBI is making more money available. RBI is making it available at a lesser price, which is like the lesser interest rate. That is why it's all the more important to sort of listen to what RBI is saying, how it's seeing, because frankly, there are also these question marks on how far can RBI really change the scenario. We've seen last week a lot of analysis on this, that RBI's monetary policy seems to have reached a point where it has stopped becoming effective because, they've cut a lot of rates, but credit growth hasn't really happened to the commensurate amount. So those are the two broad reasons. And I think the fact that RBI is, as an institution, also enjoys a lot of trust It's not a political body. I think that might be another additional factor.
Among other things, the RBI indicated that the economy, which is expected to contract for the first time ever, will take quite some time to mend and regain its pre COVID momentum. The central bank said that this was because the shock to consumption is severe and the poorest have been hit the hardest. Udit says there are no surprises in the central bank painting a grim picture of the economy.
At one level, I mean, what they've said is fairly expected because India's economy had already been sort of decelerating and faltering since 2017-18. As you know, that our growth rate had been decelerating every progressive year. And last year, we grew at only 4%, which was the lowest since the global financial crisis in 2009. So what has happened is that we already had a lot of problems in our economy in terms of the engines of growth not really firing. And COVID has just made them terribly worse because it has taken away any chance of any one of the engines staging a recovery. What essentially the RBI is saying is that, there is the uncertainty about how the economy will function in the coming months and years. They have given a clear, specific forecast on growth. And on top of that, they're saying that it will take quite some time to mend. So it is frankly left for everybody to sort of wonder and figure out for themselves how long would this take for us to sort of go back to the kind of demand, aggregate demand that was there till about March this year before COVID hit us.
Udit says that there are four engines of growth that power the Indian economy, and not one of them has been left unaffected by the virus.
So consumption, which is the biggest engine, which is around 56-57% of the GDP, that has been affected primarily because a lot of people have lost their income, a lot of jobs have been lost, and future incomes have been lost because businesses have gone under or are likely to go under. Private businesses are not investing. Their demand in the economy has also totally contracted and disappeared because why would they invest when they do not see anybody wanting to buy their products? And exports in any case were struggling. So that demand has further got affected because globally also this is a global pandemic. And so the only engine of growth that possibly can buck all of these trends is still government, which is not to say that the government itself is not stressed because government finances have totally gone out of whack. All estimates suggest that because of the revenues falling and demands for government money in terms of bailouts and handouts and any kind of fiscal impulse it can give to help people out or businesses out, that the government financing has totally been challenged. It simply doesn't have the money to spend. And it was already borrowing more than what it should have. And those borrowing requirements are now expected to just overshoot. So overall, it's a grim picture because it is not one sector of the economy which is affected. It is all sectors of the economy. And secondly, all these sectors were already struggling before COVID hit, and COVID has just made a lot of these things worse.
The RBI report says that the government has to fund the economy out of trouble. But as Udit says, its own finances are strained thanks to the pandemic and economic slowdown. So what are the options for the government in such a scenario?
What the government can do, that even though it is stressed on its own finances, government does have the ability to borrow more, even to the extent of actually printing more money and then using that money to invest in the economy. Only government can do that. And that is why RBI is sort of now looking towards the government, because RBI has done everything possible, largely from what it could do to help the scenario. It has made a lot of money available. It has made a lot of money available at cheaper rates, but it hasn't really changed the scenario commensurately. So the only option, or the big option now, is for the government to spend. Now, where can the government spend and how can the government raise that money? Now, the 2-3 things that the government can do. One is, as the RBI has also said, government could monetize the assets that it has. There's a lot of land, there are a lot of companies, which it can sort of say, okay, I'm selling them, and whatever money I get, I will then invest in the economy to either make another bridge or companies which are likely to go under if I do not help them. pay some wage bills, put the money in Narega and help the poor, or, all such activities.
And while the RBI hasn't mentioned it, there's one more option for the government: the monetization of its deficit, which is basically just ask the RBI to print more money and then spend it.
But that's a very extreme case, and I suspect that any government would be cagey about going down that path. So, in the short term, because revenues are not going to come from any other sources, asset monetization is one big idea that RBI has suggested to the government.
But the government's plan to try and monetize its assets or disinvestment in firms where the government has a stake couldn't come at a worse time. Udit says that because the global economy is also down, it would make this process much more difficult.
Under normal circumstances, you could have said, okay, here is an asset, either it's in the form of a company or shareholding in a company or land or any such thing, and said that, okay, I want to sell it, and, made some money on the side and use that money. But typically right now, all asset prices are down. Your own house would be valued less because the overall demand in the economy is down. And there'll be fewer people with the kind of money or the willingness to buy those assets from the government also. That is one problem. Second problem is that when you talk about monetizing such assets or some of the other things that RBI has said, like corporatization of railways, or making some other reforms like removing cross subsidization in power, basically raising power prices for private consumers. Many of these things are deeply political issues. They may run into a scenario where there's fierce opposition to them because people are already struggling with their jobs and incomes. And many of these issues many of these policy decisions, if suppose there's corporatization of railways, there could be a certain amount of pain on the HR side, and that could create problems. Or if you have higher prices of power, then again, people may not be happy about. So these are fairly deeply political decisions, which typically have not happened in the past because politicians didn't find it worth their while to push ahead with them. And people had a massive resistance towards such things. So to be able to do that in this scenario where already people are struggling, companies are struggling, and employees are struggling is again a tough ask. So it's both a problem of who will buy, and also the other problems of, how will you do that when you want to do it?
The RBI has suggested a long list of reforms that the government could undertake to spur the economy.
It has suggested, we should develop our corporate bond market so that the businesses can borrow money from there instead of sort of depending only on banks, where there's a massive mismatch. Banks simply cannot sustain the kind of financing needs that a growing economy like India needs. And the crucial bit is that banks have asset liability mismatch. A lot of these private sector projects might require more money and for longer period than what the bank can actually furnish. And then it has suggested, RBI suggested a lot of other basic reforms that raise the capacity in the overall economy, like raising India's competitiveness in terms of, making it easier to enforce contracts, making insolvency painless and quick. Things like property registration should be sooner and things like that. Basically, not everything requires throwing money at it. A lot of administrative reforms can make India function more efficiently. So RBI has pointed to many of those things. It has suggested a lot of these reforms, but again, I would really like to point out that none of this can happen in the very short term. I mean, things will be put in place, and then these are rules, and the economy it will take a few months to years before some of them will start showing up positive results. And there'll be some kinds of pushback because there was a reason why many of these things didn't happen in the past. So just because there's a crisis doesn't mean that everything will change, and all those difficulties which were holding back many of these reforms in the past, you cannot simply wish them away, basically.
So the RBI has also said in its report that a next sort of big date is the 31st of August when the next GDP estimate will come out, and this time from the government. So what's the expectation this time?
So yes, that's the big point, because GDP estimates in this kind of an economy where there's no clarity is something that has been lacking. As I mentioned, RBI had not given any estimates on GDP or even inflation. And we are all largely depending on, for our day-to-day analysis, we're looking at private sector analysts to figure out what might be happening. The RBI said that most of the high-frequency indicators that they are tracking right now show that the decline is unprecedented in history. That's the phrase they use, that the economic activity has taken a really sharp hit. And what has happened is that initially it was thought that once the lockdowns are removed, the nationwide lockdowns are removed, there'll be a pent-up demand and that will bring India's GDP, the growth will sort of normalize because there's a pent-up demand and it will, sort of push and make up for the lost GDP. That was hope. But what we are seeing, if you look at variables like the e-way bills, GST bills that we look at, which basically sort of is an indicator of what is the level of economic activity, trading activity in the economy, they are showing that they went up considerably in June, but then they plateaued, in July.
Udit says that there are other indicators that jumped in June as restrictions were eased and then plateaued in July. And that's prompting more fears on the economy.
There is a genuine fear whether if the economic activity continues to be affected on a regular basis, because every time you open up for business, COVID cases increase, and then again you shut down. Maybe you shut down on weekends or you shut down for 1 week or 2 weeks. I mean, that uncertainty and the disruption will carry on. And there is a very good possibility then that you may then carry on for a longer period in a low equilibrium. So we are all looking forward to what the government data on GDP is and what are the estimates they suggest. But outside, there are all kinds of possibilities between saying that the India could face a V-shaped recovery to others like Professor Pranab Sen, who is the former chief statistician, saying that India may see a contraction in GDP not just this year, but even in the next financial year. So it all depends on how COVID also is controlled in the country. But even so, because these are the formal numbers, they would have a huge impact because they will then be the base on which we could sort of frame our analysis.
This year, we are facing an extraordinary situation that even below the 10% approximate estimation, you're facing an act of God, which might even result in a contraction of the economy. To what percent or whatever, I'm not getting into that.
That's Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman speaking to reporters after a Goods and Services Tax or GST Council meeting. The meeting came even as states demanded their dues from the central government under the GST. Compensation payments to states from the central government started getting delayed since October 2019 as GST revenue started to slow. The COVID-19 pandemic has widened the gap, with GST revenues declining 41% in the April to June quarter of this year. As the Indian Express reported Thursday, many states have had to curtail payments to state government employees due to the shortage of cash. In Thursday's meeting, the central government offered the states two options. The first was on providing a special window to states in consultation with the Reserve Bank of India for borrowing 97,000 crore rupees at a reasonable interest rate. The amount can be repaid after 2022 from cess collection. The second option before states is to borrow the entire 2.35 lakh crore shortfall in revenue under the special window. The states have asked for 7 working days to consider the government's two proposals before responding to them. You were listening to The Three Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Arun George, and as always, was edited and mixed by our producer, Joshua Thomas. Before we go, here's another reminder to check out Indian Express's Explained page. You can log on to indianexpress.com/explained and find in-depth analysis by the right experts. It has everything you need to know to understand the news better and see the bigger picture. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it. Share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Audio and write to us at podcast@indianexpress.com.